Okay, so yeah, you sent over that stuff from Critter Wranglers in Knoxville, Tennessee,
Right.
about cockroach control.
Yeah.
And we're going to kind of go through that stuff and pull out what we think are some of the key things
Okay.
that our listeners should be aware of and maybe learn something too about these things. And
Yeah.
the realities of cockroach infestation and how to deal with them.
Yeah. I mean, that's really, I mean, that's the bottom line is like, and you're looking for quick knowledge, but you're looking for thorough knowledge.
Right.
And that's what we're going to try to give you here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is, some practical takeaways and also maybe some things that you didn't know about cockroaches that might be surprising to you.
I think Critter Wranglers is a good place to start.
Yeah.
They definitely seem like they've dealt with their fair share of cockroaches. So
Yeah.
let's get right into it. How do you even know you've got a cockroach problem? Well, I mean, the obvious one is seeing one.
Yeah.
And, I think most of us, react with some sort of, oh my God, when we see a cockroach, running across the floor.
Yeah.
But they make the point, that if you see one cockroach, there's probably a lot more that you're not seeing.
Right. And that's something that people might not think about,
Right.
They see one and they think, oh, it's just a random cockroach. But
Yeah.
the truth is, these things are very social and they reproduce very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so that one cockroach is probably not alone. It's
Yeah.
just the one you happen to see,
Right.
out of a much bigger population that's hidden.
Right.
So, what are some other signs that you might have a cockroach problem that aren't quite as obvious as seeing one?
Well, I mean, the thing that they say is that they have a smell.
Oh,
They have a musty, oily odor. And that can be noticeable even with a small number of roaches.
Yeah.
So, if you're noticing some weird smell
Mm-hmm.
that you just can't, figure out where it's coming from,
Right.
might be cockroaches.
Yeah, that's interesting. We often think about, seeing pests as the primary way of identifying them.
Yeah.
But, smell can be a really effective way, especially in the early stages of an infestation.
Right. But, there's also, even if you don't see them, they leave behind evidence like their droppings and things like that.
Right.
Which can kind of confirm, whether or not they're there.
Yeah. So even if you're not seeing the cockroaches themselves, you might see signs of their presence.
Right. And I think those are the things, especially like in your kitchen or in your bathroom,
Right.
to kind of look out for,
Yeah, the dark, humid spots that cockroaches love.
Right. Right.
So, we've talked about how to identify a problem,
Right.
but let's talk about why we should even care about a cockroach problem.
Yeah.
I mean, as they say, most of us shriek when we see one.
Right. But what are the actual health risks associated with cockroaches?
Well, they're quick to say that they're not going to attack you.
Right.
But the health risks can be significant.
Okay.
And the immediate thing is that they can really, cause problems for people who are sensitive to their environments, like asthmatics or people with allergies.
Right. So that's kind of the immediate impact is
Yeah.
that cockroach allergens can get airborne and cause,
Right.
worsen respiratory problems.
Yeah.
And that's not just a minor inconvenience, for people with asthma and allergies that can really
Oh, yeah.
impact their day-to-day life.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the long-term dangers are, that, as their population grows, they can spread, all sorts of germs and bacteria and diseases,
Yeah.
because they're crawling through, unsanitary places and then they're crawling across, your counters and your food and your dishes and everything else.
Right. So it's really about, public health.
Yeah. Within your own living space.
Yeah.
One thing that this information really stresses is that you shouldn't try to deal with these things yourself.
Right.
So why is DIY cockroach control kind of a losing battle?
Well, they just talk about how cockroaches are one of the most adaptable insects
Right.
and that they're extremely hard to eliminate and control.
Yeah, and that's no exaggeration. I
Yeah.
mean, cockroaches have been around for millions of years.
Right.
And they've evolved to survive in all sorts of conditions.
Yeah.
And they've even evolved to resist many common over-the-counter treatments.
Right.
Their diet, their reproductive cycles, their ability to squeeze into tiny spaces.
Right.
All these things contribute to their adaptability.
Right. And then also they're nocturnal.
Right.
So you're not even seeing the extent of the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, that leads us to the professional approach.
Right.
They really recommend leaving this to the experts.
Right.
And they say that professional services are safe and efficient. Right.
So what is it about a professional what do they know and what do they have
Yeah.
that makes such a difference?
Well, I think they have access to, more powerful tools.
Right.
And things that, the average person, just can't buy at the store.
Right, exactly.
And they also have the experience to know, where to look and how to use those tools, to their best effectiveness.
Yeah, I mean, they can identify, what kind of cockroach you're dealing with.
Right.
They know how to find their nesting areas.
Right.
And then they can apply, treatments in a really targeted way.
Right.
Maybe using baits or insect growth regulators, things that, most people don't even know about.
Right.
And they also understand cockroach behavior.
Right.
And so they can implement preventative strategies to avoid future infestations.
Right.
And they say specifically that, Critter Wranglers, serving the Knoxville area, has the tools and the methods and the experience.
Right. To completely remove cockroaches.
Right.
And they say even if you just see one cockroach, you should call them.
Right. And that's really, important, I think, because, the sooner you address the problem,
absolutely,
the less of a problem it's going to be.
Right. The longer you wait, the bigger the population grows.
Right.
And the harder and more expensive it's going to be to get rid of them.
Right. Right. So they really, put their, they really say, if you're in the Knoxville area,
right,
trust Critter Wranglers to take care of this for you.
Yeah.
And they say that they can handle problems of any size.
Right.
Completely and quickly.
Yeah. And they even provide some, what you might call real world endorsements.
Right.
They mention some customer feedback.
Yeah.
Things like, keeping my ants away, top-notch service, great guys, outstanding service.
Right.
So, just little snippets.
Yeah.
But it suggests that they've had, good outcomes for their clients.
Yeah. And I think that's always good to see, right?
Right.
That other people have had good experiences with them.
Yeah, it definitely gives you a sense of reliability.
Yeah. It's interesting because on their website, they have this section called Recent Posts.
Right.
And it's not specifically about cockroaches, but it kind of gives you a sense of, all the different pest control things that are going on in that area.
Yeah, it gives you a wider perspective
right.
on what homeowners in Tennessee might be dealing with.
Right.
And it kind of reinforces the idea that Critter Wranglers understands,
right.
The local pest landscape,
right.
not just cockroaches.
Right. So what are some of the recent posts that they have?
Well, there's one from March 5th, 2019 called What You Need to Know About Raccoon Mating Season in Tennessee.
Oh, wow.
And then there's a 2-part series on how to keep skunks away from your property.
Okay.
And that was published on February 21st and February 5th of 2019.
Okay.
So they're dealing with all sorts of different pests. Right.
And they're providing information on seasonal pest concerns.
Right.
Which, indirectly supports their credibility in handling cockroach issues.
Right. Right.
And then at the very bottom of the webpage, they have this thing that says TDA Charter number 4844. Yeah. Now, for someone who doesn't know what that means, what does that mean?
Well, that's a significant piece of information.
Yeah.
That means they have a charter or a license from a state agency.
Okay.
In this case, the Tennessee Department of Agriculture.
Okay.
And that means that they've met certain standards and regulations to operate as a pest control service in the state.
Okay.
And, that often includes things like training and certification of their technicians,
right?
Proper handling of pesticides,
right.
Adhering to safety and environmental guidelines.
Right.
So it basically gives customers a level of assurance
right.
that the company is operating legitimately and professionally.
Right, right. Okay, so we've gone through this deep dive. On cockroach control, based on what we've seen from Critter Wranglers,
right?
What are the big takeaways here?
Well, I think the key messages are the importance of early detection,
right.
Recognizing those early warning signs, like a single cockroach or a musty odor.
Right.
Also understanding that cockroaches are more than just a nuisance.
Right.
They pose real health risks.
Right.
Because they transmit germs and bacteria.
Right.
And then I think appreciating the challenges of trying to get rid of them yourself.
Right.
Because they're so adaptable and resilient.
Right.
And finally, recognizing the value of professional help,
right.
From companies like Critter Wranglers.
Yeah.
Who have the knowledge and the tools and the experience to deal with these pests safely and effectively.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great summary.
Okay.
And it really does kind of underscore the seriousness of a cockroach infestation.
Yeah.
And why that you really want to address this quickly and professionally.
Absolutely.
It makes you think, because these things are so adaptable,
right?
And there are potential health risks.
Right. Right.
What are some other things in our environment that might seem small,
right,
but could actually have big consequences,
right,
if we don't address them, proactively?
It's a good question.